The sun rose lazily over the vast stretch of farmland I had poured my soul into for nearly a decade. Golden light spilled across the rows of corn and tomatoes, kissing the earth as the rooster crowed from his perch on the old wooden fence. I took a deep breath of the crisp morning air, tinged with the scent of fresh soil and dew. This land wasn't just a farm. It was my life's work, my family's legacy, and the one place where I felt truly at peace. I had inherited the property from my grandfather, a gruff but kind-hearted man who had spent his life tilling the same soil, rain or shine. When he passed, I made a promise. I wouldn't let the land go to waste. It wasn't easy, early mornings, brutal summers, and relentless work. But every harvest, when I saw the fruits of my labor lined up in neat crates ready for market, I knew it was worth it, at least, until the Homeowners Association moved in next door. The suburban development hadn't been there when I first took over the farm. My land had once been surrounded by open fields, a patchwork of pastures and barns where old farmers like my grandpa traded stories as they fixed fences. But in the last 5 years, that had changed. The fields were flattened, the barns torn down, and in their place rose pristine, cookie-cutter houses with manicured lawns and spotless driveways. The HOA, the dreaded Homeowners Association, quickly made it clear they didn't like having a farm as their neighbor. It started with small complaints. The smell of manure after fertilizing, the noise of my tractor at dawn, the occasional rooster escaping and strutting onto their perfect sidewalks. The first few times, I shrugged it off. City folk moving to the country always had an adjustment period. But then, the letters started arriving. Dear Mr. Carter, your property's unkempt appearance is negatively impacting neighborhood aesthetics. Dear Mr. Carter, please ensure livestock remains in designated enclosures to avoid disturbances. Dear Mr. Carter, residents have expressed concerns regarding safety hazards posed by your farming equipment. I ignored them at first. My farm wasn't part of their HOA. I hadn't signed any agreements or moved into their neighborhood. This was my land, my home. They had no right to dictate what I did. But the real trouble started when they decided my crops were fair game. At first, I thought it was just a few kids snatching a couple of tomatoes or ears of corn. It happened every now and then. Curious teenagers wandering too far off the sidewalk, taking a souvenir from the funny little farm at the edge of their perfect world. But then, entire rows of vegetables began disappearing overnight. Pumpkins I had planned to sell for Halloween vanished. Apples plucked clean from the trees. I even caught a group of well-dressed women strolling through my field one morning, wicker baskets in hand, chatting as they plucked my produce like they were at a farmer's market. I stormed over, my boots crunching against the dirt. What do you think you're doing? One of the women, a blonde in expensive-looking tennis outfit, gave me a polite smile like I was the one intruding. Oh, good morning. We were just picking some fresh vegetables for dinner. I stared at her in disbelief. You're trespassing and stealing. Oh, don't be dramatic. Another woman scoffed, brushing dirt off a perfectly manicured nail. The HOA said this land wasn't properly maintained, so we assumed it was communal. Communal? My blood boiled. This is private property. I snapped. Everything you're taking, I planted. I paid for those seeds, tilled the soil, and worked every day to grow this food. Blondie sighed, exchanging a look with her friends. Well, if you don't want people picking, maybe you should put up a sign. I clenched my fists as they sauntered off, baskets full of stolen produce, laughing as if they'd done nothing wrong. That night, I put up signs big, bold ones with no trespassing and private property in bright red letters. I even set up a few trail cameras to catch any future thieves. The next morning, the signs were gone. In their place was a letter from the HOA, stuffed in my mailbox. Dear Mr. Carter, your recent signage is an eyesore and does not align with the community's aesthetic standards. Please remove all non-compliant materials immediately. I crumpled the letter in my hands. They had no jurisdiction over my land. None. And yet, They were acting like they owned it, like they had the right to dictate what I could and couldn't do. The final straw came when I checked the trail camera footage. The images were grainy but clear enough. I recognized one of the HOA board members, a smug-faced man in a polo shirt, ripping my signs down with a satisfied grin. Another camera showed residents sneaking onto my land in the dead of night, loading baskets with my crops. I wasn't just dealing with entitled neighbors. This was organized theft, sanctioned by the very people who claimed to uphold community standards. That was when I knew this wasn't going to stop until I made it stop. And if they thought they could trample all over my farm, treat my hard work like an all-you-can-eat buffet, they were about to learn the hard way. I wasn't the kind of man who backed down. I spent the next few days on high alert, patrolling my fields like a sentry. I installed more cameras, reinforced fences, and even left my truck parked by the entrance as a deterrent. But none of it stopped them. Every morning, I found more evidence of trespassers, trampled rows of lettuce missing peppers, even an entire chicken gone without a trace. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. But what really got me was how bold they were. They weren't sneaking in anymore. They were treating my farm like a public park. One afternoon, I spotted a couple of kids pulling carrots right out of the ground. I marched over, my boots heavy in the dirt. "Where are your parents?" I demanded. One of them, a boy no older than 10, blinked up at me. "Mom said we could," he said matter-of-factly, stuffing a carrot into his pocket. "Who's your mom?" He pointed toward the row of houses beyond the fence. Sure enough, a woman in yoga pants and sunglasses stood at the edge of her driveway, casually watching. When she saw me looking, she had the nerve to wave. I walked straight over, trying to keep my temper in check. "Your kids are stealing from my farm." She gave me a condescending smile. "Oh, relax. It's just a couple carrots." "That's not the point. This is private property." "Oh, come on," she scoffed. "You have so much land. It's not like you're going to miss a few vegetables." I clenched my jaw. "That's not your decision to make." She sighed, crossing her arms. "Look, the HOA has been talking about repurposing some of the unused space around here to create a more inclusive environment. You know, like a community garden." I stared at her, stunned. This is an unused space. It's my farm. And no one asked me. "Well," she said, adjusting her sunglasses, "maybe you should start thinking about what's best for the community instead of just yourself." I had to walk away before I said something I'd regret. The next morning, a letter from the HOA was waiting in my mailbox. Notice of noncompliance. "Dear Mr. Carter, we have received multiple complaints about the condition of your property and its impact on neighborhood aesthetics. As part of our ongoing efforts to enhance community cohesion, we request that you consider allowing access to your land for a shared green space. Failure to comply may result in further action." Further action? My grip on the letter tightened. This wasn't just theft anymore. They were trying to take my land. I had to do something. Escalation. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. "I don't care what they say." I told him, "I'm not part of their HOA. They have no right to tell me what to do." "You're absolutely correct," he said, but his tone was cautious. However, HOAs have been known to push boundaries. If they think they can claim your land for community use, they might try legal maneuvers to pressure you. "So what do I do?" He sighed. "First, document everything. Every letter, every incident, every time someone trespasses. The more evidence you have, the stronger your case." That night, I didn't sleep. My farm, my home, was under attack, and I wasn't sure how to fight back. But they weren't done yet. 2 days later, I came back from running errands to find a group of men in neon vests walking the perimeter of my land. One of them was marking spots with small red flags. I pulled up beside them. "What the hell is going on?" A man with a clipboard barely glanced at me. "Surveying? For what?" "Future green space development." I stared at him. "This is my property." He flipped a page on his clipboard. According to the HOA, this land is under consideration for reassessment. We're just getting preliminary measurements. My heart pounded. You can't just walk onto private property and start measuring like you own it. Take it up with the HOA, he said, uninterested. We're just doing our job. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The HOA was moving fast. Too fast. And if they were talking about reassessment, that meant they were trying to pull some legal stunt to claim my land. I needed to act. Now, a shocking revelation. That night, I pored over my grandfather's old documents, deeds, boundary markers, anything that could help me prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that this land was mine and mine alone. And then I found it. Tucked inside an old file was a decades-old agreement between my grandfather and the original township council. It outlined a land grant, stipulating that as long as the property remained an operational farm, it was legally exempt from any zoning changes or reassessments. My breath caught. This was it, the legal protection I needed. I took it straight to my lawyer the next morning. When he finished reading, he looked up with a slow, satisfied smile. This changes everything. But the HOA wasn't going to back down without a fight, and I was ready for it. The morning of a hearing arrived, and I felt like I was walking into a war zone. My lawyer, Tom, met me outside the courthouse, his leather briefcase clutched in one hand. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded, though my stomach twisted in knots. This wasn't just about proving the HOA wrong anymore. This was about my family's legacy. If I lost, I wouldn't just be giving up a few crops. I'd be letting them erase everything my grandfather and I had worked for. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter. On one side sat a handful of HOA board members, dressed in press suits, looking smug and self-assured. I spotted Judith Wallace, the HOA president, sitting front and center. Her pearl necklace gleamed under fluorescent lights, and she gave me a patronizing smile when our eyes met. On my side, a few local farmers and market vendors had shown up in support, offering nods of encouragement as I took my seat. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, entered, and the room fell silent. "All right," she said, flipping to the case file. "Let's get to it. The Homeowners Association of Willow Creek claims that Mr. Carter's land is subject to reassessment and potential rezoning. Mr. Carter, you dispute this. Mr. Garrison, you may begin." The HOA's lawyer, a slick-looking man in a navy suit, stood. "Your Honor, the HOA's goal has always been to maintain the integrity and unity of our community. Mr. Carter's property has been a point of contention among residents for years. The unkempt farmland is an eyesore, and worse, it has become a free-for-all due to his refusal to integrate with the community's needs." I clenched my fists under the table. Unkempt? Free-for-all? I wasn't the one who let people steal. Furthermore, Garrison continued, the HOA has reason to believe that parts of Mr. Carter's land fall within areas eligible for community development. Tom stood, adjusting his tie. "With all due respect, Your Honor, that is false. Mr. Carter's land has been privately owned and maintained for generations. The HOA has no jurisdiction over it." The judge nodded. "Do you have evidence to support that claim?" Tom pulled out the old land grant I had found and walked it to the judge's bench. "Your Honor, this is a legally binding agreement, signed decades ago, ensuring that Mr. Carter's property remains an agricultural exemption. As long as he continues to farm, the land is protected from any rezoning efforts." The judge scanned the document, her brow furrowing. "Interesting. Mr. Garrison, were you aware of this?" The HOA lawyer faltered. "Well, this document is old. We would argue that its relevance has expired." Tom didn't miss a beat. "The law doesn't work like that. This exemption is still valid, and any attempt to override it is not only unethical but illegal." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I stole a glance at the HOA board. For the first time, they looked nervous. Judith Wallace leaned toward Garrison, whispering furiously. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, regardless of this exemption, the reality is that Mr. Carter's actions, or lack thereof, have negatively impacted the community. The missing produce and trespassing incidents are a direct result of his unwillingness to cooperate. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I stood. With all due respect, Your Honor, they are the ones stealing from me. The judge raised an eyebrow. You have proof? Tom nodded. Yes, Your Honor. My client installed trail cameras after repeated thefts. These images clearly show HOA board members and residents trespassing and stealing crops from his land. He handed a folder of printed images to the judge. I watched her expression harden as she flipped through them. Is this true, Mr. Garrison? She asked. The HOA lawyer shifted uncomfortably. These images are circumstantial. I let out a bitter laugh. Circumstantial? That's your board president right there, ripping down my no trespassing sign. The judge's lips thinned. She turned back to the HOA table. Does the HOA have an official response? Judith Wallace finally spoke, her voice tight. Your Honor, we only wanted what was best for the community. Mr. Carter refused to work with us, so we believed it was in the neighborhood's best interest to repurpose the land. By trespassing? By theft? The judge pressed. Judith's lips clamped shut. The judge exhaled sharply. This is not how community matters should be handled. Mr. Carter's land is legally protected. The HOA has no authority over his property, and any further attempts to infringe upon it will have legal consequences. I barely stopped myself from pumping my fist in the air. The case is dismissed, the judge declared, slamming her gavel. Furthermore, the court strongly advises Mr. Carter to pursue legal action if any further trespassing or harassment occurs. The HOA board members shuffled out quickly, their heads down. Judith Wallace didn't even look at me as she stormed past. I turned to Tom, my chest heaving. We did it. He clapped me on the shoulder. Damn right we did. As I stepped outside into the fresh air, I felt something I hadn't in months. Relief. The land was mine, and no one was going to take it from me. But I also knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The HOA had lost a day, but I had no doubt they'd try again. And next time, I'd be ready. The days following the court ruling felt surreal. The weight that had been crushing me for months had finally lifted. My land was safe. My grandfather's legacy was intact. But I wasn't naive. I knew the HOA wasn't going to back off quietly. Sure enough, a few days later, I received another letter from them. My stomach twisted as I tore it open. But instead of a new threat, it was a statement of compliance. A fancy way of saying they had no choice but to acknowledge the ruling. Still, I wasn't about to let my guard down. The very next morning, I got to work reinforcing my farm security. I installed additional cameras, put up fresh no trespassing signs, and even consulted with property lawyer to draft cease and desist letters just in case. But the real test came when I saw Judith Wallace again. I was at the farmer's market, unloading crates of tomatoes and zucchini, when I caught sight of her lingering near my stand. She wasn't wearing her usual smug expression. Instead, she looked embarrassed, uncomfortable. She hesitated before approaching. Mr. Carter. I raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Wallace. She sighed, adjusting her pearl necklace like it was a nervous tic. I suppose congratulations are in order. You won. I leaned against the side of my truck. I didn't win, Judith. I defended what was mine. There's a difference. Her jaw tightened. We never meant for things to get this out of hand. I let out a humorless laugh. You had surveyors on my land. You let people steal from me. You sent legal threats. And you're telling me it wasn't supposed to get out of hand. She had the decency to look ashamed. Look, I was just trying to do what I thought was best for the community. You mean best for you. Her lips thinned, but she didn't argue. Instead, she exhaled sharply and glanced around at the other vendors. The truth is, the HOA board isn't happy with me. After what happened in court, they think I pushed too hard. They're talking about replacing me as president. I crossed my arms. Sound like a you problem. She flinched but nodded. I deserve that. For a moment, I considered just walking away. She wasn't my problem anymore. But then I thought about all the ways this could have played out differently. You know, I said, instead of trying to take my farm, you could have just asked if I wanted to help the community. She blinked. What? I gestured to my stand. I already donate extra produce to the food pantry. I sell my crops at lower prices in the grocery stores. If you had just come to me with an actual plan, something mutually beneficial, maybe we could have worked something out. She stared at me for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, she sighed. I suppose I never thought of it that way. Maybe that's why your HOA board wants you gone. A ghost of a smirk crossed her face. Maybe. With that, she turned and walked away. A new beginning. With the HOA legally out of my hair, life slowly returned to normal. My crops were thriving, my farm was secure, and the trespassing stopped, at least for the most part. There were still a few curious kids who occasionally tested the fence, but I made sure to talk to their parents before it ever became a problem. And the best part? People started seeing my farm for what it really was, a resource, not an inconvenience. One day, an elderly couple from the neighborhood stopped by my farm stand. We're sorry for how things turned out, the woman said. Not everyone in the HOA agreed with what they did. Her husband nodded. We're just glad you're still here. The neighborhood wouldn't be the same without this farm. It wasn't an apology from the HOA itself, but it was something. As summer turned into fall, something unexpected happened. Local families started asking if they could visit my farm, not just taking what they wanted. Parents brought their kids to see how vegetables grew. A retired teacher volunteered to help set up a small gardening workshop. At first, I was hesitant. But then I realized this wasn't the same entitled group that had tried to take from me. These were people who respected my farm and wanted to learn. So I made a decision. I set aside a small section near the front of my property and designated it as a community garden plot. Not some forced HOA takeover, but a space where people, under my terms, could grow their own small crops. I even set up a donation system where folks could pitch in a little money to help maintain it. And you know what? It worked. People stopped stealing from me because they no longer felt the need to. Instead, they came to me for advice, for seedlings, for tips on how to keep their tomato plants from wilting in the heat. My farm wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I had fought for my land, and I had won. But more than that, I had finally found a way to turn all that conflict into something good. Standing at the edge of my farm, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: pride. The past year had tested me in ways I never could have imagined. I had fought tooth and nail to protect what was mine, to honor the legacy of my grandfather, and to stand up against people who thought they could take whatever they wanted. At first, I had seen the HOA as nothing more than a group of entitled, power-hungry bureaucrats looking to bulldoze over everything in their path. And in some ways, I wasn't wrong. They had trespassed, stolen from me, and tried to strip me of my rights. But looking back, I realized that their greed had been rooted in something deeper, a disconnect between their world and mine. They didn't understand what it meant to work the land, to build something from nothing, to pour sweat and soul into the soil. To them, my farm had been little more than an empty lot full of resources they could repurpose. They didn't see the generations of hands that had tilled this ground before me. But I had learned something, too. I had spent so much time fighting against the HOA that I hadn't stopped to consider if there was a way to turn the battle into an opportunity. It took everything falling apart for me to see that not everyone in the community had been against me. Some had simply been misled, others had remained silent out of fear or uncertainty. The real victory wasn't just winning in court. It was in reclaiming my place, not just as a farmer, but as a part of something bigger. Lessons learned, If there's one thing I took away from this ordeal, it's that standing your ground doesn't always mean standing alone. At first, I had been stubborn, unwilling to engage with the community beyond my farm stand. And why should I have? I had seen them as the enemy, the people who turn a blind eye while their HOA stole from me. But when the dust settled, I realized there had been voices on my side all along. The elderly couple who came to my market stand, the vendors who supported me, even the families who just wanted to be part of something real. Instead of shutting them out, I found a way to invite them in on my terms. The community garden wasn't something I ever imagined I'd allow on my property. But once I did, I saw the impact it had. People started respecting the farm in a way they never had before. They weren't just taking from it. They were learning from it. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. People don't appreciate what they don't understand. Before, the HOA saw my farm as nothing more than an unused expanse of land. Now, they saw it as a thriving piece of the community. Before, I saw them as nothing more than entitled suburbanites. Now, I saw that some of them simply lacked a connection to the land that I had been raised with. I didn't forgive the ones who had tried to take from me. I wasn't naive enough to believe they had changed overnight. But I no longer let them control my life, either. And that was the real victory. Looking ahead, I know this fight won't be the last one I ever face. The world has a way of testing those who refuse to back down. There will always be people who think they can push others around, people who believe that money and power give them the right to take whatever they want. But now I know how to fight, not just with lawsuits and fences, but with something even stronger, community. My grandfather used to say that the land isn't just dirt and crops. It's a living thing. It grows, it changes, and if you take care of it, it takes care of you in return. I finally understand what he meant. My farm isn't just mine. It's a piece of history, a piece of this town, a piece of something bigger than myself. And as long as I'm standing, as long as I have soil under my feet and the will to fight for it, no one is ever going to take it from me again.